Ever get the feeling history class maybe glossed over a few things, like maybe skipped a chapter or two? Well, today, we're going back to revisit one of those chapters. It's the one about U.S. intervention in Latin America and the Caribbean. And we're talking early 20th century here. And our guide for this little trip back in time is Jorge Majfud's The Wild Frontier. And just a heads up, this isn't just going to be about dusty old treaties. We're talking about people, power struggles, the kind of stuff that might sound familiar even now. So, expert speaker, you ready to dive into the wild frontier with me?
Absolutely. Majfud really doesn't pull any punches. He challenges the traditional narratives we're so used to hearing. Get ready for some serious aha moments.
I'm ready. So, for everyone listening, let's set the stage here. Early 1900s, the U.S. is fresh off the Spanish-American War, feeling pretty good about themselves. And you've got Latin America, they're trying to find their footing after, well, centuries of colonial rule. It's kind of a recipe for disaster if you think about it.
Yeah, it really is. You've got the U.S. on the one side, newly powerful, and they're eager to protect their interests, which more and more means business interests. And then on the other side, you've got these Latin American nations, technically independent.
But they're struggling. Internal conflicts,
Yeah.
economic vulnerability. It's like the perfect recipe for intervention.
And that's where the U.S. decides to step in.
Right.
Like this big brother figure, there to keep things in line. At least that's the story we're often told. But Majfud, he digs into some specific events, and it starts to paint a very different picture. Like in 1914 in Veracruz, Mexico, you know what sparked the U.S. military occupation there? A dispute over gun salutes. Seriously.
It's wild, isn't it? You read that and think, how does something that sounds like a schoolyard argument turn into a full-blown military action? And that's what makes Majfud's perspective so important. He peels back those layers, all those justifications, and he shows how these seemingly minor incidents, they're often just pretexts to go after larger economic and geopolitical goals.
So there's more to the story than a few missed gun salutes. Oh yeah, way more. For example, take the Tampico incident. The official story is that the U.S. was demanding an apology from Mexico because a few U.S. sailors were detained, briefly detained. But what's really going on behind the scenes? Oil. The U.S. had huge investments in Mexico's oil industry, especially in the Tampico region.
So the U.S. demands an apology and a 21-gun salute, no less. Which seems a little, I don't know, excessive, don't you think?
Right. And what happens? Mexico hesitates. I mean, wouldn't you? And that's all the U.S. needs. They use it as an excuse. Send in a massive naval force. Occupy Veracruz. Classic case of might makes right. And it really shows how economic interest, especially that desire to control oil, really shaped U.S. foreign policy.
And then there's that whole argument that the U.S. was just trying to protect American citizens. Majfud mentions 50,000 Americans fleeing Mexico City during this time.
Right. And it's true. There were real dangers for U.S. citizens living abroad. But you have to remember how those situations were often amplified, used strategically to get the public on board with intervention. And let's not forget, the presence of U.S. businesses in these regions often added to the instability in the first place.
It's complicated.
It really is.
So we've got these interventions framed as promoting stability. But what about the human cost? Majfud talks about hundreds of Mexicans killed during the occupation of Veracruz, many of them civilians.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking. And it's a reminder that these weren't just geopolitical chess moves. These decisions had devastating consequences. Real people, real lives. And it wasn't just about casualties of war. You also see the suppression of dissent, like with Javide Dar, this journalist. She stood up to the Texas Rangers when they tried to censor her newspaper, El Progreso, which was incredibly brave, especially back then.
Talk about courage. Standing up to that kind of power. And speaking of power, the U.S. wasn't just flexing its muscles in Mexico. They were setting up protectorates in places like Nicaragua, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. So what exactly did that even mean back then?
Protectorates. It was basically a nicer way of saying we're in control without actually calling it colonization. But in reality, it allowed the U.S. to exert a huge amount of influence over these countries' political and economic affairs, often to their detriment.
And that brings us to the Bryan Chamorro Treaty. Can you imagine someone leasing out their entire country for 99 years? Sounds like a joke, right? But that's basically what happened in Nicaragua in 1914.
It's hard to wrap your head around. That treaty gave the U.S. exclusive rights to build a canal through Nicaragua and lease land for naval bases. I mean, imagine a foreign power having that kind of control over decisions that affect your country's future. It's a prime example of how the U.S. used its power to secure its interests at the expense of these nations' independence. And speaking of prime examples,
the Dominican Republic, the U.S. just kind of took over there. No treaty, no agreement, just Straight up military occupation.
Yeah, the U.S. occupation of the Dominican Republic, which started in 1916, that was a blatant power grab. They dissolved the Dominican government, disarmed the citizens, imposed martial law. They even rewrote the Dominican Constitution, all to benefit American businesses. It was brutal. The U.S. flexing its military might to impose its will, all under the guise of restoring order.
And it's amazing how often these interventions, they were justified by this idea of bringing civilization to these nations. It's condescending and more than a little racist.
That's a really important point, this notion of Anglo-Saxon superiority. It was everywhere in the U.S. at that time, and it fueled the sense of entitlement, that the U.S. had the right to intervene, especially in nations they considered less civilized.
It's the same playbook every time. Mexico, Nicaragua, the Dominican Republic. And it makes me think about something as Majfud talks about, the influence of straight-up racist ideologies on U.S. policy. Like, he specifically mentions Madison Grant and his book, The Passing of the Great Race. What's the story there?
Well, this is where things get really unsettling. Grant's book, it came out in 1916, and it argued for the superiority of the Nordic race and warned about its decline because of intermingling with inferior races. And this wasn't just some fringe theory. It was surprisingly mainstream. Even Theodore Roosevelt was a fan. And he was a former president.
So this idea of racial hierarchy, this fear of being overrun, it wasn't just some fringe belief. It was present in the halls of power. And it makes you wonder, how much did these ideas actually shape U.S. actions in Latin America?
It's the question, isn't it? And not just about the past, but about the present as well.
It's almost like these events were setting the stage for something much bigger and much more sinister. But before we go down that road, let's shift gears for a moment and talk about the resistance movements that emerged during this period. Because it wasn't just one-sided domination, right?
Absolutely not. In fact, the stories of resistance are some of the most inspiring and heartbreaking parts of this history. They really are. For every act of oppression, there's a story of someone fighting back, fighting for their rights, their dignity, their way of life. We can't forget those stories.
And Majfud really highlights some incredible examples, like Charlemagne Perrault in Haiti, leading a guerrilla resistance movement against the U.S. Marines in the early 1900s. What a story.
Perrault, he's like the embodiment of resistance, a true Haitian nationalist. He refused to accept U.S. military rule.
Think about that for a second. The courage it took to rally your people against the U.S. Marines.
He knew what his country had fought so hard for, independence. And he wasn't going to give up on that.
It's just tragic. They became a martyr for the cause, killed by the U.S. Marines.
It's a recurring theme, unfortunately, these figures. Revered as heroes in their own countries, they get reduced to footnotes, if they're even mentioned at all, in the U.S. version of history.
Yeah, it's like their stories get erased. Like with the Plan of San Diego. That's something I'd never even heard of before reading Majfud.
The Plan of San Diego, it really shows how desperate things had become for people of Mexican descent, especially in the Southwest. Imagine an armed uprising to create a whole new republic.
It was a bold plan, and it wasn't just a small group. This plan called for Mexican Americans, Black Americans, Japanese Americans, Native Americans, all to join forces, a coalition of the marginalized, fighting for a piece of the pie.
And for good reason. Decades of discrimination, land theft, violence. The Plan of San Diego was a response to that.
And how did the U.S. government respond?
With the Texas Rangers.
The Texas Rangers. They're often romanticized, aren't they? But Majfud doesn't hold back. He calls them Los Diablos, the devils. He talks about how they terrorize communities, extrajudicial killings. It's a dark picture.
It was a dark time. Lynchings. We usually associate those with violence against Black Americans, but they were used against Mexicans and Mexican Americans too.
Targeted for their ethnicity, their language. It's just horrifying.
It really is, and it shows how interconnected these forms of prejudice were. And it wasn't just happening in some far-off place. It was Texas, California, Oklahoma, the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921.
Tulsa? How does that tie into all of this?
Majfud connects those dots, the Tulsa Massacre. For those who don't know, it was a horrific two-day rampage, a white mob. Destroyed Tulsa's Black community, known as Black Wall Street. Hundreds dead, countless others displaced.
It's hard to even imagine something like that happening. Just barbaric.
It was, fueled by economic resentment, sensationalized journalism, and racism. And the tactics they used, even the language. It echoes what we see in the U.S. interventions in Latin America.
You're saying there are parallels between the violence in Tulsa and the violence inflicted on Mexicans, Haitians.
Absolutely. The dehumanization, the justification of violence.
To protect American interests.
Exactly. It's a pattern.
Like with the bombing of Occidental, Nicaragua.
Right. 1927. The U.S. Marines bombed the city, trying to suppress Augusto Sandino's rebels, who were fighting for Nicaragua's independence.
And Majfud sees a connection there. With Tulsa.
He does. He argues that the decision to use air power against civilians, it came from the same place as the Tulsa massacre.
Wow.
It's not that one event directly caused the other, but there are patterns, a shared mentality, this idea that some groups of people are expendable, that violence is justified in the name of progress or order.
It's a lot to think about.
It is. But it's important. These events, they weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a much larger pattern, a continuum of violence. That shaped the relationship between the U.S. and Latin America, and is still felt today.
It really is a lot, and it makes you think about the long-term impact of all this. Like, how did these interventions in the early 1900s, how did they shape the relationship between the U.S. and Latin America? Moving forward.
It's a complicated legacy for sure. I mean, on the one hand, you have this deep resentment towards the U.S. that grew from these interventions, anti-American sentiment, and that often created an opening for authoritarian regimes to take hold, regimes that were more interested in serving their own interests or the interests of the U.S. rather than the needs of their people.
It's like that vicious cycle again. The U.S. intervenes, says it's to create stability, but their actions end up creating more instability, more resentment, which then becomes a justification for further intervention.
Exactly. And we see this pattern again and again throughout history, and not just in Latin America, but in other parts of the world too. This belief that the U.S. has the right, even the obligation, to intervene in the affairs of other nations. It's been a constant in U.S. foreign policy.
And Majfud seems to be saying that this belief, it's rooted in a sense of cultural and racial superiority, that the U.S. represents a more advanced civilization. And so they have this duty to guide other nations towards that, or even force them.
You're right. It wasn't just about economics or geopolitics. It was about this deeply ingrained belief in American exceptionalism.
So we have to understand the ideology behind these interventions.
We do.
It's about understanding the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves, and how those stories, even the ones based on a sense of superiority, can have real consequences.
They can have devastating consequences.
And it makes you think about the people who resisted, the Jovita Idars, the Charlemagne Peraltes, these individuals and communities who stood up to that power.
They're an inspiration. They remind us that even when things seem hopeless,
When the odds are stacked against you.
that yearning for freedom, for self-determination, it can never be totally extinguished.
And their stories challenge us to confront some uncomfortable truths about our own history and to work towards a better future.
A more just future, a more equitable future.
Which brings us back to one of Majfud's main points, the power of narrative. He's urging us to question the official stories, to look for different perspectives, to dig deeper, to uncover the voices and experiences that have been silenced.
Because those voices, those stories, they have the power to change how we understand the past and how we see the future.
It's not just about deeds and names. It's about people.
Real people.
Yeah.
Making choices. Facing consequences.
So as we wrap up this deep dive,
Yeah.
what are some of the key takeaways you hope listeners will remember?
I think the most important thing to remember is that history isn't just something that happened a long time ago. It's still with us, shaping our world in ways we might not even realize.
Like those echoes we talked about.
Exactly. And by understanding the complexities of history, we can hopefully learn from the past and build a better future.
It's about recognizing those patterns, the dangers of unchecked power, the importance of listening to marginalized voices, and the power of resistance.
It's about understanding that we're all connected across time, across borders, and that the choices we make today, they have consequences.
They really do. Well said. That's a powerful note to end on. So to everyone listening, think about how this history, the history of U.S. intervention, how it might change your perspective on what's happening in the world today. What assumptions are you willing to question? What more do you want to learn? Keep those questions in mind, because the deep dive, it never really ends.